Now, the second main component that researchers point to as contributing significantly to our happiness and sense of well-being is autonomy. And what they mean by autonomy is a sense of being in control of one's life, or perhaps a sense of freedom. Uh, and again, this is maybe more than anything else we're going to talk about in this presentation. This is something that many of us really feel that we lack at this moment, is control over our lives. There is this illness that has spread around the country. We are not able to work as we normally do. We are not able to even move about as we normally do. A lot of us can feel very helpless in the face of this virus that we are still fighting, still struggling to get under control. Still a long way off from a vaccine. And so many of us are feeling rather helpless, sort of the opposite of this sense of autonomy that researchers point to as so important for our happiness. So let's try and understand this idea of autonomy and maybe what can help us to feel a little bit better about this in our present situation. So first, some wisdom from our ancient traditions. So the first tradition I want to point to is ancient Stoicism, that comes out of the thought of figures like Epictetus, who you see his statue here. And the idea behind Stoicism is that the path to happiness in this philosophy lies in simply accepting the moment as it presents itself, and not allowing one to be controlled or tossed about by one's desires for pleasure or a fear of pain. But again, just of using one's mind to try and understand the world, to try and understand the situation as it presents itself, and to accept the situation as it is, to accept one's place in the situation as it presents itself. So this idea of in Stoicism is that virtue is the only good. In other words, something within us is the only good to be pursued, and that one should try and develop a sort of indifference to external things like health and wealth, because these are not good or bad in themselves in this Stoic understanding. Uh, Another very ancient tradition, coming from actually several of our Eastern religious traditions. We have these practices that are designed to try and promote that kind of inner peace. So the practice of yoga has been somewhat changed but popularized recently in Western culture. But yoga originally is this idea of a discipline. It's a movement of the body. It's sort of uniting the body and the soul in order to discipline and promote health and well-being within the body. Very closely related to this are practices of meditation. Um, for example, a very common meditation is a breathing meditation, where we simply sit, breathe deeply, and pay attention to our breathing. So this might mean breathing deeply and then just focusing on the air going in and out of the body, or perhaps the sensation of the chest rising and falling. But simply focusing, giving our attention to our breathing and to nothing else. And when we become distracted, focusing on our breathing again. And so, again, this idea of just bringing our attention to the present, focusing on ourselves rather than focusing on the externals. Sometimes meditation might be complemented with a mantra, so repeating some kind of phrase, which again is just intended to help bring attention back to center rather than wherever our thoughts go racing off to. And so in these Eastern traditions, people have found for thousands of years that these kind of practices, yoga, meditation, mantras, that they help to develop this sense of inner calm, of an inner peace, and even of freedom. As you see Here I have this image and quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, a very famous Buddhist spiritual leader, pointing to the way that these kind of practices can promote this inner sense of freedom. And Thich Nhat Hanh is a wonderful example himself. It's amazing, some of these Buddhist monks, the extent of self-control that they have developed and what it enables them to do. Thich Nhat Hanh, in one of his books, recounts the experience of going to the dentist and I believe having to get a cavity filled. But because of his Buddhist convictions, they don't partake in any kind of stimulant, even any kind of anesthesia. And so he had this dental procedure done without anesthesia. All he did was simply looked at his hand and focused very attentively on his hand and the features of his hand. And so that kind of cultivating of attention and that sort of inner control enabled him to endure a fairly painful procedure that most of us would have required being medicated for. So if he's able to do this for where this kind of pain is being directly inflicted on him, this I think suggests to us that there might be something beneficial to us as we are trying to deal with somewhat challenging circumstances in our lives right now. The Christian tradition offers similar wisdom. So even though we think about meditation as being associated with these Eastern traditions, Christianity has its own tradition of contemplative prayer, which embodies many of the same ideas and practices. The sort of theology behind this in Christianity is the realization that because God is always dwelling all around us and within us, that we already possess within ourselves all that we ever need to be content, to be fulfilled. And that if we're unhappy, it's because we're distracted by all the things around us. And so there's this practice of centering prayer, to bring our attention to center, to inside ourselves where we can find God. So this is done similar to Eastern meditation by taking a certain posture, typically sitting upright so that the diaphragm and lungs can really expand so that we can fill our lungs with air and breathe deeply. Taking deep breaths, settling into a calm rhythm of breathing. And then just as there's sort of a mantra in some of these Eastern traditions, a very old practice in Christianity is repeating some kind of prayer word in order to keep our attention centered. Very traditional prayer is the Jesus prayer. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And so people will simply repeat this prayer over and over, or especially when they find themselves being distracted or their thoughts wandering, to bring their attention back to center and just rest in God's presence there. I mentioned Cardinal Nguyen Van Tham in the first segment. This was key to his practice, this kind of contemplative prayer, which seems to be a really important part of what, again, enabled him to survive those long years in imprisonment, sometimes in terrible, terrible conditions. Okay, so this is some wisdom from our ancient traditions. As we look to more contemporary research, we really find this ancient wisdom confirmed. So what do our researchers tell us about how to pursue this sense of autonomy and how to be happy? Well, again, consistent with what we've just seen, researchers suggest that people are happier when they pursue internal control rather than trying to control externals, rather than trying to control things around them. Well, why might this be the case? Well, as so many of us are experiencing right now, we will often find ourselves frustrated if we are bent on controlling things around us, because so often things escape our control. Some of us might actually be very good about this. We might be very together and organized and competent. We might feel that we have things under control most of the time. But one thing this crisis is indicating is that this is something that is not under anyone's control right now. And if you have staked all your happiness on managing the situation around you, this is probably an especially difficult time right now. So for that reason, because the externals will never be totally in our control, and therefore will often be frustrating to us, researchers suggest we should focus more on internal control. So what do they mean by that? Well, a couple of examples would be practicing mindfulness. So mindfulness can mean like similar to what we've just seen in these ancient traditions, just being present in the moment, just simply focusing our attention on what we are doing right now. Researchers have found that almost regardless of what we are doing, even if it's a normally enjoyable activity, if our thoughts are wandering, we are less happy in that moment. So we find ourselves more happy, more content when we are just focused on doing what we are doing at that moment. So that might just be, if you're going for a walk, just paying attention to the sensation of your feet. If with that breathing meditation that we just mentioned, just paying attention to your own breath for a moment. Being in the moment in this way is inherently enjoyable. Another way of practicing this is emotional regulation. Um, and what that means is simply, for starters, naming our emotions. If I am frustrated by the long line at the supermarket, to just say, oh, Pat is frustrated about this. And simply naming, sort of objectifying the emotion in that moment, it gives you more control over it, gives you more power over it. It's when we're not aware of what is going on within us that we lack control, that we tend to find ourselves unhappy and tossed about by our feelings. So a first step is just naming those emotions as they arise, and then working to address them, perhaps by using some of these mindfulness techniques that we were just talking about. So exercising, practicing mindfulness in this way, it makes us happier because it tends to slow down our thoughts. It regulates, it controls those anxious thoughts. And when we do that, when our thoughts aren't constantly racing and catastrophizing and thinking about all the terrible things that could happen or did happen, when we just slow down our thoughts, it helps us to be less anxious. It helps us to react better to the situations that we encounter. And there's ample research showing that in the long term, this improves our health. So building off this, a couple of exercises to help you develop this sense of autonomy, this sense of inner freedom. I've talked about this kind of breathing meditation, of just breathing deeply and just paying attention to the sensation of the air going in and out, the chest rising and falling. And when you notice yourself distracted, just again, bringing your attention back to the breathing. Another I suggested was mindful action. And this can be anything. So it can be mindful about your breathing, mindful about your walking. Even washing dishes can be a meditation. So often when we're doing the dishes, we're just trying to get it done so that we can start watching whatever on Netflix. But even washing dishes in itself can be inherently enjoyable if we just sort of enjoy the sensation of the warm water and the texture of the plate. So just give yourself over, pay attention to whatever you are doing, and you will find your day to be much more enjoyable and less anxiety inducing. And finally, try practicing that emotional regulation. This is a trying time. There's lots to be anxious about. There's lots that can be frustrating. Just try naming those emotions as they arise. And maybe when you see that happening, take a few deep breaths and see if that doesn't help you to feel better in those situations. Okay. So this is our second main component of happiness is developing the sense of autonomy or this kind of inner freedom.